Today we're going to get back into the book of Luke, chapter 2, and specifically today we're just going to talk about verse number 7. We're still living in Christmas time, even though as I take this, today is actually Halloween. I heard the story of a millionaire that wanted to teach a small town a practical lesson. So he dressed up like a bum, looked like an outcast that had absolutely nothing. And he walked through the streets of this little town on Christmas Eve. It was pouring down raining outside. And he went house to house trying to get somebody to help him, what looked to be a bum. He got excuse after excuse as he went from door to door. Finally, he knocked on the door of the house and the man said to him, "Look, I want to help you. I've got small children in the house, so I can't take you in, but I want to help you. If you'll get in my car, I'll take you to where I know I can get you some help." So he got him in the car and he took him to a place where he knew he could get him food and shelter and clothing. He set him up and took care of him. The next day, the millionaire came back to his house and gave him a check for $1 million. Can you imagine? The newspapers heard about this and it made the front pages of the local newspaper. Can you imagine how the neighbors felt who had seen this same guy knock on their door and they didn't have time for him or they didn't have room for him? Can you imagine what they felt when they read this story in the papers? How close they were to $1 million and they let it slip through their fingers? Well, the same thing happened, but to a greater extent, in the year somewhere around 4 or 5 BC, when a poor, shabby-looking couple knocked on the door of an inn and the innkeeper didn't have any room for them. I want to read that story again with you. It says in Luke chapter 2, verse number 7 is all we'll focus on today. It says, "And she brought first her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." Have you ever wondered what the poor innkeeper would have felt like when years later he discovered that the King of Kings had been born in his stable and he hadn't made room for them in his inn? Can you imagine the place he would have made for himself in history? He would have notched out and carved out a piece of history for himself if only he had had room for Jesus. The birth of Jesus Christ is prophetic and descriptive of the rest of Christ's life. Think about it. Look at the parallels. He was born in poverty, and he lived out his life in poverty. He was born without a place to sleep other than a stall, and he spent his entire adult life without a place to sleep. Someone said that the only place the world ever made for Jesus was on the cross. His birth and the characteristics of his birth were really prophetic of the kind of life that he would live. He didn't even have a place to lay his head, no roof over him. Now, to be honest with you, I've heard preachers preach sermons and talk about the innkeeper and tear him up for not having room for Jesus. And they would just burn his hide. But the more I read this story and the more I understand what happened, the more sympathetic I am with the innkeeper. I've learned not to be near as judgmental of this innkeeper as maybe I was in my early years. When you read the story, it's clear that there was no malice in the heart of the innkeeper toward Joseph and Mary. We need to get the picture out of our minds of some guy and his bride pulling up at a Holiday Inn sign with a gruff desk keeper saying, "Get out of here, I don't have room for you." That's one of the problems of reading a first century book in the 20th century. You read that Joseph knocked on the door of the inn and there wasn't any room. and all of a sudden in your mind, you see a Holiday Inn sign flashing out front, no vacancy. That's about as far from reality as you can possibly get. Basically, the inn where Joseph and Mary were approaching was nothing but a rough enclosure. I'm not talking about just the place where Jesus was born. I'm talking about the inn or the hotel itself. The inn really wasn't anything, much less the stable where they ended up. The place where Joseph and Mary went describes their own financial and economic situation. They didn't go to a nice place. They went to a place where the poor of society would go. Henriksen, in his commentary on this book of the Bible, describes what this inn would be like. Let me read you what he says. The inn may have been a caravansary that was built on four sides of an inner court with 2 stories. The top story would be the bedroom, one big huge bedroom, and the floor would be where the animals were kept. They could have stayed on the bottom floor, or it could have been on the outside of the wall where the animals were kept, or it could have been a cave attached to the inn, or it could have become a cave stable. It could have been just a stopping place where animals were kept. That was an adjoining shed out back. Regardless, Jesus was born in a stable, laid in a feeding trough for animals, possibly a niche carved out in a cave wall. Born in a stable, not a palace, laid in a feeding trough. This is a pretty good description of where Joseph and Mary would have spent this night. In that day, people traveled on animals. It was dusty and dry, and the inn was really not even a place of comfort. It was more a place of protection. It would just have 4 walls to at least keep the thieves out from breaking in and stealing everything while you slept. So basically, you're looking at 4 walls with a kind of semi-roof over the top, and people would bring their own bedding and food. They'd pay just a little token money, simply have a place to lay their head. Even that wasn't comfortable. The bottom floor was nothing but dirt and mud, and that would often be where they kept the animals. So Jesus' mother and father may have been there on the mud floor or on the outside where it was attached to a cave. On top of that, this was the busiest day of the innkeeper's entire life. He was making more money than he'd ever dreamed of making. Remember, the census was out. Everybody was traveling, going to their hometown. People had been knocking on his door all day. He simply didn't have room for this couple. Joseph and Mary had traveled somewhere between 80 and 90 miles. Here's a woman who is days away from having a baby, and she rides a camel 80 miles. Then she doesn't have a place to sleep. The truth of the matter is that most scholars believe that Mary wasn't even required to make the trip. The husband is the one who had to go and register in the census. Most historians and scholars believe it was not necessary for Mary to go along. But there was no way that Joseph was going to leave his pregnant fiancée in Nazareth. You know why? Because the rumors were still out that she was going to have this baby out of wedlock. And they were saying she had probably been unfaithful to the man she had been engaged to. She was the talk of town. The scuttlebutt was all about Mary. There was no way Joseph was going to leave his young bride to be ridiculed and mocked and be the laughingstock of the town. He probably said to her, "Honey, the ride may be rough, but at least I'll be with you." He wasn't going to leave his bride there to have a baby without him. I also believe that this young couple had read the Old Testament, what we now call Micah chapter 5, and they knew that God was arranging for the Messiah to be born in Bethlehem. So Joseph brought his wife on this long trip. They got there and the innkeeper didn't have room for them. Most of us can read this story and see what a tragic mistake the innkeeper made. But we can't see that we make that same mistake every day of our life, even as believers. We simply get so busy that we don't make time or room for Jesus in our lives. All of the rooms in our mind are filled. All of the hours in our schedule are filled to capacity. And there's simply no place for Jesus. Again, somebody said the only place the world's ever made for Jesus was the cross. John said about Jesus, he came into his own, and his own received him not. The reaction of the innkeeper is really the reaction that most people have had about Jesus. We've turned our eyes away because we were simply too busy. I want to take a couple of lessons to talk about this, and I'll break it down and we'll talk about what was going on with the innkeeper in our next study.